Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And we've got a great guest tonight, David Jamieson, who I'll introduce in a couple of minutes or so. He'll be talking about a conference that's aimed at looking at what's happened since the referendum 10 years ago. That's right, 10 years ago. On the date of my birthday, there was a referendum in which Scots were asked if they wanted to be an independent sovereign nation. And they decided, no, actually, on this occasion, we don't. Since then, there have been copious attempts to make sure that Scots don't get the chance to reconsider that decision. But that's the nature of referenda. It takes a while to sort of recast things once they've taken place. It's not impossible, happens all the time. I think Ireland has had about 5 or 6 referenda, if not more, and the Swiss have one every couple of weeks or so, according to one of our guests a couple of months ago. It's no biggie. An adult democracy should be able to cope with it. In the UK, of course, that's very difficult because we're not talking about adults making decisions very often. And talking about childish responses, what about the winter fuel allowance? I mean, talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Now, I know there will be an enormous number of attempts to try and persuade the Scottish electorate that perhaps the Labour MPs in Scotland went through the wrong lobby and ended up voting for something which they swore blind prior to the general election they would never support. Nonetheless, they did it. I think there might have been 1, if not 2 abstentions, but the reality was that the legislation was passed. And of course, the great irony is that, well, people are being terribly exercised about that. The fact is that if all the MPs from Scotland had been SNP, the result would have been exactly the same, i.e. that the legislation would have passed. And in fact, a number of pensioners who will not be with us after the winter would, in fact, have perhaps been around. But that's the reality of the way things are done in this island. And we'll get a chance to talk about that shortly. This, as you know, is The Nation Talks. It's your antidote to the BBC. We spend a fraction of what they spend, and yet we're able to have guests talk to you for an hour. And we're talking about quality guests. And tonight's no exception. It's my privilege to introduce to you David Jamieson, who is participating in a conference, as I said earlier, in Glasgow on the 14th of September. Now, there's only 10 to 15 tickets left, but you'll find the details on the website, which will be posted shortly, and you can get them on Eventbrite. You'll have to rush. If there's only 10 to 15 tickets left. If you can't make it, you'll be able to watch it live stream on Indie Live, and I strongly commend the conference to you. It's a unique opportunity. There's the details on the screen now. It's well worth your time tuning in. And of course, if you can't make the conference in person, if you can't watch it on Indie Live, then you can always see it on YouTube. So, without any further ado, let me introduce our guest tonight. David Jamieson is joining us. David, how are you?
I'm grand, John. Thanks very much for having me on.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you for joining us tonight. Now, I've said this is a great conference, but why don't you put the flesh on the bones of that? What's being discussed? Why is it being discussed? And how will it make a difference?
Well, I mean, initially, when we came up with the idea for this conference, and I have to commend above all Dr. James Foley, who's also speaking at the conference, and a group of other academics, some people around our website, Conter, but a much broader section of people as well, just felt that there was so little discussion 10 years on about the Scottish independence referendum. There were very few. I mean, this was planned before there were any other events planned to commemorate the 18th of September 2014, which was, of course, the day of the vote in the independence referendum. And just in general, in wider civic society, in the media, we felt that there was very little marking of the 10-year anniversary, and even less serious, sort of rigorous intellectual engagement with the history of these last 10 years. And that's despite the fact that it was, of course, quite a momentous event and a very unusual one in Scottish political life and in wider British political life. And we felt that 2014 tells a very interesting story, not just about Scotland and about Scottish politics, but actually about a very particular period in time in world politics and in European politics that, in a sense, we're still living in. I mean, time has moved on, conditions in politics have changed, not least here in Scotland. But a look back, I think, still says things that are informative about the nature of our politics and the nature of our society 10 years later. And as you can see from the conference, I mean, it's a very kind of pluralistic, it's broadly on the kind of left of the independence movement, I suppose you'd say, but it's quite a pluralistic group of people, some of whom will be debating with each other, and I think that's important as well. I think we shouldn't just, ruminate over these issues, important though rumination and, detailed exploration may be. I think that there are real debates and disagreements left over from the last 10 years, many of which need to be addressed, I think, many of which are kind of festering in obscurity after the kind of hectic nature of events, especially in the last two or 3 years. So we felt it was really important for us to kind of pay some respect to the politics of the last 10 years, to take it seriously. I do note, by the way, there's a BBC documentary clearly set to be the kind of flagship documentary covering the 2014 moment, and it's presented as a kind of soap opera psychodrama between a couple of politicians. And on the one hand, you have to take leading politicians very seriously, of course, but in general, this to me is not a serious coverage, a serious investigation of what was momentous in terms of Scottish politics 10 years ago.
Well, there's a little cliche that says that if you're not terribly serious about something, you talk about people. If you're slightly more serious, you talk about things. And if you're very serious, you talk about principles and ideas. And the BBC, of course, isn't serious about Scotland. And therefore, it's no surprise they've reduced it to a soap opera. Because the value of reducing stuff to personalities is that you don't have to do a lot of research. You can simply parade people in front of the camera and say, would you like to say something nasty about the person who's about to appear next? But that's a million miles from what you're doing. And I commend you. I really do. And I want to mention an interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting. We've had guests from south of the border on the show, and their biggest concern, and it was expressed quite recently in a paper that I just found fascinating. It was reprinted in the New Statesman, and it was by Anthony Barnett, and it's called "What Is Starmer's Story?" And essentially, he focuses in on England's summer riots have violently exposed the failure to resolve our national question. And the point he makes is, and it's been echoed by many guests from south of the border on the show, is that the Scots are always talking about the Constitution and what they want to see and the improvements. And your conference conforms to that precisely. And that was what is the effect? What is the aftermath? What about capitalism, class and power in a nationalist era? All very, very important. And the point they make, and it's a decent one, I have to say, I think, who's having that discussion in England?
Well, I mean, I suppose there are some people. I mean, not at the level of Starmer and the kind of media outriders who support him in that level, I suppose, of sort of elite society. Yeah, I don't think that there's any attempt to come to terms with the real nature of where Britain's at. I mean, this is also a conference that should be said about Britain, about Scottish politics, about devolution, and about the challenge that independence posed in 2014 in the context of a British state. And I think, much has changed in the last 10 years. Something that hasn't really changed is that Britain still appears a very dysfunctional political entity. And if anything, that to me seems to be getting worse and not better. Starmer was, I suppose, for a certain layer of people in British society, going to be a salvation from the dysfunction of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and so on. And that, I think, explains the kind of mood of authoritarianism around his politics. I mean, he's come in basically saying he's going to restore order. He is a very statal figure, let's remember. I mean, he was a chief prosecutor. That's how he views himself. That's how he advertises himself. And he's going to be a kind of sure hand in the British state. That's how he's projected himself. He's dealt with the dissidents inside his own party. Now he's going to push through austerity. He's here to give us the bad news. I saw one former Observer editor, a ghastly phrase said, he's like the headmaster who you won't like, but you'll learn to respect. I mean, this stuff it's sinister, right? And the consequences of it we're already seeing, which is, the events in the last couple of days and so on, the slashing of the winter fuel allowance and so on. But I can't see for the life of me how any of this is going to promote stability in the British state. And we can see that, I think, from the summer of riots, which are, I mean, partially a consequence of a kind of confluence of a few things. One of which is Britain has been a state at war for decades against predominantly Arab and Muslim countries. And the ideological drive required to legitimize those wars has a consequence in wider society. And the other kind of stream is that you look at where these riots took place. The large parts of England outside of the southeast, which have been decimated first by deindustrialization and then by austerity, and where in many of these small towns, in particular in the North and Midlands, conditions are just desperate. I mean, they are absolutely desperate. So the British model remains clearly broken. And that much still, I think, requires us to think through the problem of the British state and British politics.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I mean, I think the difficulty that Starmer has is that in desperately wishing to avoid people in the city clutching at their perils at the thought of a Labour government, I think he's appealing to a constituency which will drop him in a heartbeat. And I think he will come to regret this approach. I mean, right now he's getting an easy ride from the media because the media, by and large, or the people who own it, are hugely content with a continuation of Tory policies, which effectively is what he's doing. He's not doing anything that I suspect they wouldn't have done. He's somehow managed to avoid the consequences of saying before the election there was no big gap, and then afterwards saying there was a huge gap, as if he suddenly realised that the reality is that a cast of thousands had indicated there was a huge gap in the nation's finances. And then he goes on to pretend it's like a household and therefore we have to tax people to compensate. It's a nonsense. I mean, there isn't a single reputable economist accepts that. And yet they trot this nonsense out. Now, I know it's probably holy writ at the Treasury, but it's not accepted by many outside that charmed circle. So the reality, he's positing austerity in a way that is almost certain to bring a calamity. I mean, I can just imagine the headlines as little old ladies expire over the winter period. and the relatives lay the blame fairly squarely at his door. You won't have the cover of the right-wing press when that happens.
And I mean, all of this is being done in the apparent belief that you can magic economic growth out of this situation. But of course, one of the arguments frequently made by economists about austerity was that it would undercut growth. So I don't know where they think they're going to get this magical growth from, that saves the nation's finances, and the private sector starts bringing in revenues and all this that repair the public realm, which is disintegrating. Not just in England, you may have seen city councils are on the brink of bankruptcy or going bankrupt after so many years of this stuff. But it's also, I mean, you can see the public realm deteriorating in Scotland as well. I mean, where I live in Glasgow, it's visibly deteriorating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you just sort of think, how there seems to be this belief that you can just do this indefinitely, and people will never cotton on to it or never resist or never react in outrage. But it also traps, of course, Holyrood in this situation that we're now very used to. And one of the things that's kind of painful about 2014 is that it was an opportunity to break out of this bind where, for example, cuts are passed at Westminster. They are then sent up to Edinburgh. Holyrood points at Westminster. Westminster points at Holyrood. And we're in the middle, losing our public realm, losing jobs, losing pay, losing conditions, watching society unwind. And for a period, there was a rebellion against this situation, but we are now back in the situation where you have two rival governments, both putatively on the centre left, but both passing cuts. I mean, yesterday there was the winter fuel allowance cut at Westminster, which will of course impact up here. And then today I see that the SNP has in fact been defeated in their attempts to return peak rail fares. So, we're getting it from both sides, but there's a real deficit of accountability. Politicians now in general, the culture of our politics is these elite figures holding up their hands and saying, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can do. And it's a vicious cycle, because this is the sort of atmosphere that the far right feed on. Because they say, look, our politics is elitist and decadent and corrupt, and you sort of think, well, shoe fits, right?
Yeah.
And this is the situation we're going to face in Scotland, because there weren't any riots, of the kind that occurred in England and in Scotland in the summer. But if you look, Reform are on 9%, which means that they'll win seats in the next Scottish election if that figure holds up. And they have they have a national profile now. They have resources. They won a UKIP. Sorry, it's not the same party, but of course it's the successor party to UKIP. UKIP won an MEP here before, so that it's not like this has never happened before. And I think that we now also face this challenge from Reform, who, if they are smart, and I don't know how smart they are in Scotland, they don't have I don't know any of the leaders or anything in Scotland, I don't know if they have any. If they're smart, they'll target the Scottish Parliament. They'll say, this Parliament has produced a political class who are self-indulgent and in it for themselves, and they're not doing anything for the country. And I think that could be a very potent attack line if that's the one that's taken, because I think it will resonate with a good section of Scottish society.
Yeah, I suspect it probably would. But on the other hand, I think the problems that Westminster will have to confront will be even greater. And the difference will be that, there's a proportional system in Scotland that doesn't produce the extraordinary imbalances that you get in a Westminster election. I mean, if I remember right, the gap between the number of votes that the SNP got and Labour got was only about 5 or 6%. But it produces a hugely disproportional outcome. Starmer will be sitting there with this enormous majority, and pretty much everything he does next year will fail because the economy he's mismanaging it from the beginning. But even if he didn't manage it, I suspect the results of the outcome from Brexit will bedevil the British economy for years to come. And the only way around that is to restore that connection with Europe. I can't see any other way of doing it that will put the British economy on an even keel. Right
Well,
now,
I should say, by the way, because this is sort of what I'm discussing at the conference. So I'm in a session about Europe and the United States and the external relations between a putative independent Scotland and the wider world.
yeah,
I mean, Scotland and Britain, though there are particular manifestations of the crises of our times here, the whole wider international apparatus, and particularly in Europe, is also in turmoil. I mean, I was just thinking the other day about how much is going on in Europe. Barnier coming in as, this kind of EU viceroy to govern France as part of a kind of party of order, where politics is sort of broken down because Macron doesn't want to let the left form a government. In Germany, freedom of movement has just been suspended by the government. You have a debt crisis in Italy. You have officials in the European institutions saying we are in a desperate situation in competition with China. We're falling behind. You have, the front lines in Ukraine continuing to crumble. I mean, there is, I think, very little stability out there to be found. So I'm not convinced that reintegration with Europe would help this situation. And also that Britain's economic crises run deep into the model of what Britain has become as an international finance hub, as deeply integrated into the wider circuits of the Western economic and political order, which, as I say, is in much greater crisis. And this has, I think, a great bearing on the discussion about Scottish independence. And again, like I say, I mean, these are not the views of everyone who's speaking at the conference, because it includes even, people like Alan Smith and so on, who I'm certain would disagree with what I'm saying now. But there is a great question for those of us, I think, who want to continue the project of, for anyone who wants to continue the project of Scottish independence. Because the model that we had back in 2014 no longer really makes sense. And the model that the likes of Nicola Sturgeon developed in the intervening years, I think it makes even less sense. So what we eventually ended up with was this idea of Scotland will become an independent state by abandoning the traditional form of nation statehood and decanting our sovereignty into various foreign bodies and foreign institutions. So we'll join the EU, we'll join NATO, right? Obviously, kind of headed up by the United States. And we'll also give up our currency, sovereignty, and monetary policy to the Bank of England. And we'll enter joint financial regulation with the City of London, and so on. And this was kind of similar to what was in 2014, but on steroids. And so we'll have kind of almost independence without independence. And who could that upset in the international system? No one's going to be troubled by this. And because we're so untroubling to, the powerful actors in the international system, this will smooth the path for an independent country. And I always doubted the wisdom of this approach, because I always felt that the European Union, or I have for a long time anyway, thought that the European Union and NATO and the Bank of England, the institutions of the British state, would not be happy to facilitate the breakup of the British state, which is such an important part of the kind of transatlantic political order. That was true then. It was true a few years ago. but it's becoming more and more true because, of course, the whole international system is increasingly gripped by a competition between the United States and its Western allies on the one hand, and countries like China and Russia and Iran on the other. So it seems to me that the road that we were traveling in 2014 is closed. There is no longer a viable situation where the big brokers in the international system are willing to grant us legitimacy to pursue independence. Luckily, I think that there's an alternative to that, which is the alternative that was chosen by successful national independence movements in the past, which is, you say, we're not basing our legitimacy in what the European Union think and what NATO think and what America think and what our UK state think. We're basing our legitimacy in popular sovereignty. We're basing our legitimacy in the people. And others can like it or not like it. Others can accept us or not accept us.
What does that mean? Many people watching and listening tonight that will strike a chord with many of them. But what does it mean in effect?
So in the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'm giving you here the speech to a significant degree that I'll be giving on Saturday. So, if you can't get tickets because they are running out, at least you're going to get this bit. In the 19th and 20th centuries, national independence movements frequently promoted themselves on the basis of popular sovereignty.
Yes.
On the basis of the idea that they represented the will of the people to be an independent nation state. And if you look at the literature of nationalist movements in that period, and even going back even further to, say, the American Revolution, all of their kind of documents will make a statement, like the founding documents of the American Revolution say, we the people, right? This is a revolutionary, a very radical idea at the time that it's uttered, because, of course, traditionally legitimacy was based in other institutions, empires, kings, kingdoms, etc. So to say we the people are establishing this democratic political system was a revolutionary act. But if you look through the history of the 19th and 20th century, you'll find again and again nationalist movements use this claim. In Ireland, if you go back to the turn of the century, their movement was called Sinn Féin, which literally means we ourselves. Right? Yeah. This is the kind of claim that all nationalist movements traditionally make.
I still want to examine what that means in practical terms, but let's go back and just deal with something which is I always find fascinating. Was Benjamin Franklin in Paris supplicating himself in meetings with the king, trying to convince him that this document, that we the people are in charge, had no impact on His Majesty, the French state, by saying we need another 1 million livres and we could use a whole bunch of troops. And by the way, what are you doing with your navy? Now, I suspect none of this would have worked had there not been a sort of realpolitik as far as France is concerned, because they really wanted Canada and they really wanted not to get themselves involved in a Louisiana Purchase situation as subsequently happened. In other words, they wanted to keep a presence in North America, and so therefore supporting these revolutionaries came across as sounding like a terribly good idea. But it must have sounded very weird to the king to be told that this guy in front of him thought that the people were sovereign and not the crown. But can we move on to the point you made about practical sovereignty? Because in many instances, respects, I agree. But what would it mean right now? I mean, for example, many people who've come on this show have said to us, the SNP needs to be more assertive. And it sounds to me like what you're talking about is a form of assertion. In other words, you're asserting popular sovereignty, and therefore that has to have a meaning. For me, I find it difficult to talk about assertion if you meekly echo what was done at Westminster the day before. That doesn't sound like assertion to me. That sounds like the very opposite of assertion.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is I think for many independence supporters and nationalists and so on who were active in 2014, this is the $1 million question, because you get people trying to resolve this contradiction. Why is it that we have a nationalist party, a pro-independence party, and that's its whole raison d'etre, and yet it pursues independence in this kind of meek way?
Yeah.
But people usually state the problem and don't answer. I think there is an answer. I mean, do you remember Nicola Sturgeon saying she didn't like the word national being in the SNP? And I believe Humza Yousaf said something similar. And people always say, people are often annoyed by that and say, why are you saying this? Without trying to answer the question. Again, I think this has to do with the history of nation states and independence movements. I think people sometimes say it's because Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want people to think she's like a racial nationalist, like she's a Nazi. I don't think anyone's in any danger of thinking that Nicola Sturgeon or John Swinney or Humza Yousaf are Nazis. I don't think anyone believes that, anyone serious, right? I mean, I'm sure you can find some ridiculous
I can find one or two
troll on social media, but I don't think anyone's in it, who's serious about politics and making a choice over national independence is concerned about these things. Why does Nicola Sturgeon say that? I think she said it because she wanted to say that she didn't believe in nation statehood in the way that those people did in the 19th and the first part of the 20th century, right? And right up until the kind of 80s and 90s and so on. Why? Because nation statehood proved to be a very disruptive force in the world system. Just think about some of the countries that became independent in the 20th century. Ireland, Vietnam, Algeria, China, India, right? The emergence of these independent states reorganized the entire world system, redrew boundaries and borders all over the map. The map we have today comes from these very kind of confrontational nationalist movements who said, we are doing this to the international authorities of the day. We are doing this whether you like it or not, because we represent popular will, we represent popular sovereignty. And because of that, we live in a very different world today with very, very more countries in it than we did 100 years ago. Now, compare that to the vision of international affairs that you see in the Scottish National Party, and indeed some other independence movements in Europe today, which is, I mean, in the case of Scotland, we are not going to upset anything. We're not going to rock any apple carts. We're not going to rock any boats, right? We're going to seamlessly sluice into a series of international organizations. And I could talk about what I think the specific problems are with each of those institutions. I mean, I think NATO's wrecked Europe, really, when you look at the effects of the bombing of Libya, the occupation of Afghanistan, the situation in Ukraine. I think that the EU is inherently unstable. But nonetheless, the point here is what this means in the end is like Nicola Sturgeon or John Swinney or whoever is leading the SNP, because whatever the differences within the SNP, this idea is widely assented to. Their project for how you secure national independence is not principally based in popular sovereignty. It's principally based in the legitimacy that you get from elites. It's principally based in going, frankly, cap in hand to various powerful figures in the United States, in continental Europe. This has been a big project for the SNP in the last few years, is to establish, a presence in European politics with offices and meetings and so on.
I hear what you're saying, and
if I can
finish the point, and let me ask a question.
Now, we tried this in 2014, right? And it's little remembered today. We asked the United States; they said no. Barack Obama came out the day before the vote, and he said no. We asked the European Union, and you only need to consult the acquis, the body of rules in the European Union. It says no. right, to the type of independence that we are suggesting. You say you need to have a central bank, you need to have your own currency. And it's not that surprising that the British government said no to a currency union in 2014, but they did. They said no. So we have, if you like, empirically, we've tested this approach to independence, and I think it's been found wanting.
So what would you propose then? Say, for example, the head of the SNP is not John Swinney anymore. He's been replaced by David Jamieson. What would your first measures be in implementing what you just said?
I mean, I think that once you accept popular sovereignty as the basis of a national independence movement, you instantly flip everything, right? Because if I'm no longer principally seeking the legitimacy that I would get from the EU or the United States or whoever, I can start thinking about tactics much broader than simply standing in elections and asking a state who will keep saying no if I can have another referendum, right? So, I mean...
So what would you do? Go ahead to have a referendum? Just declare yourself independent?
Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, I think, like, where we are right now, because we are so committed to having the British state be our friends and the European Union be our friends. And
that's a given. That's off the agenda.
But
what do you propose?
Well, I then propose that we readdress the whole basis of how we're pursuing the movement. I'm not saying, by the way, that I have like some kind of program of action that we'd instantly embark upon. But people keep saying, why do we keep standing in elections? Going to Westminster cap in hand and saying, can we have another independence referendum? They keep saying no, and we keep doing nothing. It's because of this. It's because we view any form of political action besides doing that as inherently illegitimate. And Nicola Sturgeon...
That's the problem, David, and you've very eloquently and effectively outlined that problem. The question it begs then is, what should be done to change that? You talk about a change of approach, but can we talk about the nuts and bolts of that change? What would it look like? Because at some point you have to say to the Scottish people, that was then, this is now, and this is what it consists of, and these are the steps, these are the elements, the building blocks, if you like. What form would those take?
Even if I had like a specific blueprint, I don't think that would be much use at this point, because I think the whole point of this is, what I'm suggesting is, if we're going to reground the Scottish independence movement, as I suggest, in popular sovereignty, and not in this approach, this kind of elitist approach that the SNP has pursued, it then becomes a debate for the whole movement about how we do that, about whether we adopt that approach at all, and thereby, you know, like which tactics and strategies we deploy. I mean, you're asking me what practically we do. There are dozens and dozens of successful national independence movements around the world which succeeded in their actions, and they used literally hundreds of different strategies and tactics, from boycotts to civil disobedience to things that obviously no one in Scotland is suggesting. I mean, in Cuba, they took to the Sierra Maestra, right? And I'm not envisaging John Swinney disappearing up
the Pasha Hills,
the Pasha Hills, right? There are obviously tactics that people would be willing to adopt in pursuit of Scottish independence, and some that they wouldn't. But if we're consigning ourselves to standing in elections and begging people in positions of power cap in hand, I can tell you right now that's going nowhere. And I think supporters of Scottish independence have to ask themselves, how far are they willing to go to pursue their political ends? How badly do they want this? I mean, what I'm talking about here isn't sort of an unknown quantity. You only need to look over at Barcelona, where the Catalan independence movement, which is also struggling, like I'm not saying that there's any path that's easy here, right? It's got serious problems of its own, but their repertoire of tactics and strategies is far broader. right? Even within an independence movement, which is relatively similar to ours, than what we've been approaching. But I really do think that the crucial question, the central question is, how do you imagine the political project of national independence to play out? What do we understand the essential properties of that movement to be? Because at the moment, it really is a kind of gentleman's agreement between people in positions of power. If we have people like Nicola Sturgeon and Angus Robertson who present themselves to be cut from the same cloth as the Barniers and the Obamas and the leaders of the liberal institutional order in the West, we'll just be accepted into this family of nations. I think that's been disproven. And I think that means we need to come back to the drawing board if we really want this, if we really want Scottish independence. And I would remind people that all the way from independence movements and across civic protest movements and rights movements and all kinds of political movements throughout history, they have frequently failed, tried again, failed again, tried again. But they were only successful when they tried something new. They were only successful when they reconsidered the nature of their politics, the nature of their movement. So, I mean, what I'm saying is I don't want to come up with a program, right? Because my argument is not that I have the answers. My argument only is what I'm claiming I can see, and what I think other people can see as well, is the current program is at a dead end. And we therefore need to reconceive of the movement if it is to have any future whatsoever. And the last thing I'd say is now would be the time to do it, because there's not going to be an independence referendum in 3 years' time or 5 years' time. There might not be in 10 years' time, right? Well, I think we need to start thinking about this as a longer-term project, one of the essential parts of which is the intellectual groundwork and an attempt to understand what it is we are trying to achieve. I would also say that for me, the object of Scottish independence is popular sovereignty. The object of Scottish independence is being able to make our own decisions. What exactly is the point of becoming independent? To join NATO and enter down the road of calamity in confrontations with China and Russia? I would love it if there could be a small northern European country that could have its own independent foreign policy and step back from this and say, this is the road to hell. What we are watching with the growing confrontations between the United States and the United States and Russia and China and so on, this is the road to hell. And we don't want anything to do with it. We want a world based on peace and cooperation and so forth. That would be a much healthier situation to be in. And I just don't understand the appeal of independence for as a kind of badge, but we've decanted all our sovereignty along the way.
I think if you talked about independence movements have all gone through phases and cycles and stuff like that, and that's true, and that also applies to the American situation too. I mean, I spoke earlier about Benjamin Franklin, but Benjamin Franklin at one time was a passionate unionist who ended up being a revolutionary, mainly because he felt that the British treated what he thought was his nation appallingly. But it's hard to escape from class here. I mean, there's an old cliche that says revolutions don't happen when the poor march, but when the lawyers do. And my sense of it is the American Revolution was a bit like that. It took middle-class people to become agitated before anything really happened. And they became agitated because they were losing money.
Well, this is a fascinating aspect of why I think the Scottish independence movement has been different. So, I mean, I've used Ireland as an example, but in the Irish case, the leadership of the movement was almost exclusively drawn from what people would call the petty bourgeoisie, small business owners, farmers, shopkeepers, and so on. But the arms and legs of the movement were the rural poor, the small urban working class. And the point about this nationalist ideology was it could unite these various elements against a common enemy. I mean, I should say, I'm sitting here saying we need a national independence movement based on popular sovereignty. On a certain level, I'm sort of uncomfortable with these ideas because I recognize that there are class differences within a nation. There's not a singular national will or popular will or popular sovereignty. These things are complex, and very often the tragedy of nationalist movements in the 20th century was that the middle class leadership would betray or curtail the working class element of that movement. But here's what's interesting in Scotland. There was a time when those middle class elements were drawn to nationalism because it would give them greater sovereignty and autonomy in their own political expression. I would say that in Scotland today, there is a middle class element of the independence movement, and then there's a working class element of the independence movement. But the middle class element are no longer sovereigntist. They're the opposite. They are now the people who are saying, no, we must have relations with the European Union. We must have relations with NATO. And that's partly because the changes which have occurred inside the middle class. So there's also a question for us, which is in which parts of the population do we want this independence movement to be based? And I mean, the working class are the majority. We actually need them to achieve independence. And we have to ask ourselves the question, which we did in 2014 as well. What will it take to persuade a working class majority population that this fight for independence is worth it for them? How does it represent? How might it represent their interests and so on? If we try and sell, if the leadership of the SNP tries to sell a version of the independence movement, which is a kind of status quo movement, will keep things the same, will maintain relations with the British state and the EU and NATO and so on. What are the consequences of that for actually winning a majority of support? And I would say that they are negative in the round. Of course, it wins over a part of the population. You know, Nicola Sturgeon, for example, was quite good at winning fair weather friends for independence from parts of the middle class who, as soon as Brexit was a done deal, have sort of, I think, drifted away from the independence side. So I agree with you. The class dynamic here, I think, is crucial, and again, something which merits much more discussion.
So the SNP have proposed a constitutional convention. Is that something you would take part in?
A constitutional convention? Who's proposing this? I've not seen this.
It's SNP policy, and they will open it up to other groups and parties and individuals.
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how it pans out. But I mean, I've got absolutely no belief whatsoever that anything presided over by the SNP leadership is going to open itself to, I think, a serious, deep-rooted debate about what is necessary. I mean, I don't want to sort of characterize people, some of whom will be at the conference on Saturday, by the way, as kind of wicked or conspiratorial, or like they're hiding some hidden agenda from us. And I think they're not doing that at all. Like I said to you earlier, you sometimes see this thing of, like, I see memes on social media saying Nicola Sturgeon's a British state plant and all this sort of stuff. No, she isn't. Right. You know, she's someone who believes in this stuff. She is someone who's convinced that you can only get independence if you approach the question in this conservative way. I think she's totally wrong. I think that the conservatism, if you want to understand why we're not getting any closer to independence, this for me is at the root and crux of the issue. But the people who make this argument for, so there's an academic called Christopher Bickerton who calls this new format for national politics member statehood. He says we're not nation states in the classical format anymore. We're member states. We are states that seek legitimacy by relations between state elites, not between elites and the population. But, for example, as in the Council of Ministers at the European Union, it's all the big boys together in a room, and we are carved out. right? This is the format of modern politics. This is why I'd argue sort of democratic politics is in decline. But I'm sure that, the Angus Robertsons and so on of this world believe that this is the correct approach, and I'm sure that it will retard the development of the independence movement. One last point I just want to make here is I actually think that this format, independence by member statehood, is terminal. I think if we don't escape it, it will destroy the whole concept of Scottish independence. Let's not forget as well, and I was reminded of this because the BBC documentary about Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon rather implies that Scots have always been debating the question of our national independence, and that we were always going to end up at a referendum. I think that's totally wrong. I think that the origins of the Scottish independence movement are very modern. They're very recent. Of course, there have always been a minority who have supported independence going way back into, the formation of the SNP back in the 1930s and so on. But it was always an ultra-marginal issue right up until about 2011, 2012, when suddenly there was a convergence of interest around this question. And I think that's related, by the way, to a recognition that our political institutions are failing us, that they are in many cases decomposing, that we live in a very unjust, very hierarchical social order, and that things could be better and that we could live in a more democratic situation. And Scottish independence was just one manifestation of that mood. And that's one of the things I think that makes it Scottish independence a very interesting recent historical question. But it also implies something else, which is just as it was born, figuratively speaking, yesterday, it could die tomorrow. I think people need to recognize, because I think there is still, in pro-independence circles, often a degree of complacency about where we're at here. You'll hear people say the country's still split 50-50 and so on. If we can't solve these knotty problems, these constitutional problems, political problems that I think are imminent within our movement, I think it's really possible the frustration will just burn large numbers of people out, and the question will fizzle away. We have a window of time now where we can readdress the question and see if we can form a viable movement.
A lot of people listening to you, David, may be saying things like, or thinking things like, well, this is all very well and good, and I agree with a lot of what David is saying. Other people have disagreed, but the reality is that Scotland is a trading nation. You have to have relationships with people who are going to buy your goods and services. That's a fact, right? There's nothing new about that argument. How is that? People will be concerned that if one simply makes a declaration and says, right, popular sovereignty, we did an opinion poll, it produced 51%, and therefore we're now effectively free. They'll say, it's just going to be a shambles.
But that was exactly the same dilemma that every single independence movement in history faced. So when the Irish became independent, it was a very, very tough business. I'm talking even after, right, the revolution. In fact, the De Valera's Republican government chose an economic war with Britain, right? I mean, in history, the sanctions were much worse, right, than they'd be for us. And the other thing I would say to that is, well, I'd say two further things. If you're saying economic blackmail can stop us, then we're done, right? Because if you're saying, well, if the threat that they're going to cut off trade with you would stop us feasibly from becoming independent, even with 51% of the population and so on our side, it's over. This is why I say popular sovereignty is so important. If we place conditions on us becoming independent, if we place those conditions ourselves, the enemies of our movement will pick up those conditions and say, yeah, you're not having it, right? It's very easy to destroy a movement that says, here are the conditions for our victory, right? And the third thing I would say is this. We are in a changing of the guard in the international system, right? Not changing of the guard. We are witnessing the decline of the traditional hegemon in the world system, the decline of the United States. We are witnessing the decline of Europe. We are seeing the rise of new actors in the international system. Now, as I've said, I don't want to be chained to one side of that equation, right? Wouldn't it be better to stand back and say, we'll have friendly relations with anyone who will have friendly relations with us, but we're not going to be told what to do, and we're not going to be told that we're not allowed to exist. By the way, I mean, all of this is hypothetical at this point because we're nowhere near being able to present the Scottish independence cause as the will of the Scottish people and so on.
Exactly.
But if we don't proceed from the basis that that is the objective from the movement, I think we'll never be in that position.
Yeah, I mean, people have argued, and I have to say, agreed with them, that we need to be much more assertive. And because the reality is that if you're not assertive, it's a zero-sum game. Someone will be assertive on you, and you'll have to live with the consequences of their assertion. As
I
opposed
should
to
say, I realize I've kind of dominated this
don't
section.
worry about it. Don't worry about it.
I would say if you want to argue with me, if you want to see other people argue with me, then do come along to the conference or watch the Independence live stream.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, folks. I mean, we've had lots of questions, but I mean, Jock Wilson is saying, who is going to stop trading with Scotland? I don't know. We didn't get that far. And other people have said, well, the working classes are the hardest to reach. Well, that didn't seem to be a problem before 2004. And there's various groups around like Salvo and others, and people are asking, have you been in touch with them?
I mean, I think that some of these groups are engaging in kind of technical legal questions, which I don't think are the heart of the matter, such as I understand them. I wouldn't want to misrepresent their position. Yeah. I think that, like I say, that we do have to enter into a period. I mean, I'm sure that some people could say that the conference we're hosting is a talking shop. I think we're at the talking shop point. I mean, this is why I don't want to say, here's my platform for how we become independents, because I don't think we're there. Like, I don't think that we're advanced enough. I think we're very institutionally degraded as an independence movement at this point. I think we're at the point where we seriously need to reconsider the whole project, because the last thing we tried didn't work. Since then, we've languished with the old model. We desperately need a new model if it's going to be viable as a movement. So I would invite people, as it were, to that conversation, to the talking shop. The talking shop is very necessary.
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, there are no talking shops, as you call them, in England, and people desperately want to have a talking shop in England. There's nobody doing this, and a lot of people we've had on the show are deeply troubled by that. So here you are, folks. If you want to engage in this debate, if you liked what David was saying, if you didn't like what David was saying, equally, go along on Saturday, and because I think we've got 10 to 15 tickets left. So you go on Eventbrite and you can turn up on Saturday and put your points directly to David. We haven't had much chance to take too many of your questions for the simple reason that a lot of what David had to say, I think, needed to be said, and it would have been to subtract from what he was saying by taking too many questions. But we always appreciate your questions. Furthermore, as I said before, you can go along between 10 on Saturday and 5 o'clock. If you can't make it, it'll be on live stream on Indie Live, and then subsequently it'll be on YouTube. So, thank you for your contribution, Mr. E. Because unlike we don't have a £300 million budget like BBC Scotland, we very much depend on our audience being not only supporters morally, but also financially. So thank you for that. A big thank you also to you, David. It's been, we set out to inform, educate and entertain, and I think you've done all of that tonight. best of luck with your conference on Saturday. I hope it goes
Thank you very
well.
much. Thank you, John.
And if you get a chance to mention the show to James, Dr. James Foley, that would be good too.
I will
So,
do.
thank you again. Appreciate it a lot. If you can stick around for a few minutes after we go off air, I'd be very grateful. Well, there you are, folks. Another great show tonight, as I promised you. We always keep our promises here. It's not like the Labour Party. And we're looking forward to another great guest next week. Thank you for joining us. Look after yourselves. Stay safe. Good night.